Hey there, buckaroos and buckarettes. If you have not yet read our mentor text for this series, Bryan Stevenson's A Presumption of Guilt, it is the first link down in the description. Please do so. I'm going to be talking in depth about some of the evidence he uses to support his claim, because here's the theme song. Okay, we are talking evidence in this episode. Here's the thing about evidence. It has to be true. It has to be real. Doesn't really matter how often I say that. I still get a lot of essays that include no real, true, factual evidence. There's a lot of, well, you know, if somebody did this, I could understand if they were, you know, maybe this would. No, I don't want any of that. Okay? You haven't gone to school for the last 10, 11, 12 years to make stuff up. You need hard, factual, real, concrete evidence. One of the classes I teach is the AP English Language and Composition class, and AP used to include a phrase in their argument essay questions. The phrase was readings, observations, and experience. They would give the question and then tell students to answer it using evidence from readings, observations, and experience. I think they've moved on from that. They're using more just like appropriate evidence as their suggestion. But I still like readings, observations, and evidence. I like it for two reasons. Number one, it spells the word row. Makes it an acronym, and you know how much I love acronyms. My favorite. But number two, it serves as a really good reminder for students about where to look for appropriate evidence. Readings, things you should have learned in school. That's like history, who are the people, the places, the times. Literature, the plots and the characters and the themes. Government or civics or economic principles like all men being created equal, or supply and demand. Even things like your own research. That can count as readings. Again, you've been in school. You've taken history classes, you've taken English classes, you've taken science classes, math classes, art, music. You have in your brain a wealth of information to draw upon. And where that wealth of information has gaps, where it's missing something that you know you need or you feel you need, you can do the research to find that evidence. Now let's take a look at Bryan Stevenson. It's not a surprise that his text includes evidence from history. I mean, his claim, we put the claim back up on the screen? Yeah, his claim has the word history right in it. Okay, so yes, he's going to use stuff from history, and here's just one example. This is actually an example from right after he states his claim. At the Civil War's end, black autonomy expanded, but white supremacy remained deeply rooted. All right, he sets us up for what the evidence he's going to provide. Let's look at it again and look at what's highlighted here. State legislatures passed black codes, which created new criminal offenses such as vagrancy and loitering, and led to the mass arrest of black people. Then, relying on language in the 13th Amendment that prohibits slavery and involuntary servitude, quote, except as punishment for crime, quote, lawmakers authorized, etc. So he is trying to establish here, again, this is right after he makes his claim, he's establishing that in the post-Civil War period, there were still those who sought to mistreat African Americans and essentially exploit them as slaves, even though slavery had been outlawed. And this is actually a good time to talk about one other thing that comes up a lot in my classroom. This has absolutely nothing to do with the Stevenson text, but here's a puzzle. Okay, so you see in this puzzle, there is somewhere hidden in this puzzle a human face, right? It's mostly coffee beans, but there is a human face in there somewhere. Oh, there it is, right there. Yeah, and I didn't give you a lot of time, and there are a whole bunch of these things on the internet. You can do the Google and find them for yourself. But here's the point. It's hard to find the face in a bunch of beans. And it's much easier if I do something like this. That's just the face. When you are quoting from a source, you should do the equivalent of quoting the face and not the beans. You'll notice that what Stevenson is doing here in this text, and let's put it up with some examples circled. Yeah, there we go. He is using vagrancy and loitering. He's got them in quotation marks. These are obviously things that are taken from what he has researched. Okay, and there's another one. Put it back up. Yeah, except as punishment for a crime. That's a line out of the 13th Amendment. He did not give us the entire 13th Amendment. He did not give us pages and pages of laws that have been written in the post-Civil War period. He gave us 2 words and then a, what is that, 5-word, 6-word phrase? And that was enough. Because if he'd quoted the entire 13th Amendment, we would not necessarily have known what part he was talking about. So he just took the small part that he needed. When you are quoting from a source, if at all possible, you should use as few words of theirs as you can. And that brings us to O for observations. So we can put it up again. Observations are things that you can see around you in the everyday world. That can include things in culture, like music, television, movies, books. It can include things in current events. You know, what's in the news right now or recently, something that has happened that is not yet far enough away to be history. Stevenson is very good at this because his whole point, if you remember his claim, was that this historical legacy of lynching in the South, in the United States, has a profound effect, significant actually was his word, on the way things are happening in America today, particularly in our criminal justice system. So yes, he's going to want to talk about things from today. Let's put up another piece of his evidence. He says, today, large racial disparities continue in capital sentencing. Capital meaning executions, capital punishment. African Americans make up less than 13% of the national population, but nearly 42% of those currently on death row and 34% of those executed since 1976. In 96% of states where researchers have examined the relationship between race and the death penalty, results reveal a pattern of discrimination based on the race of the victim, the race of the defendant, or both. So there, I know that, I read a lot, that was a lot, but it is evidence from today. These are real, current statistics that Stevenson is talking about. If he wants to make that connection between the lynchings in the past and the criminal justice system of today, he's got to have those current events kinds of statistics. Okay? So it makes perfect sense for him to include it there. And that brings us to E for experience. And again, I'll put it up there on the screen. The short way of thinking about it is experience is things that have happened to you or to someone you know. And I've probably already had the light bulb if you watched episode 2. You know that Bryan Stevenson started his essay by telling the story of how he was at the wrong end of a police officer's gun himself. He's been in that situation. But here's the nice thing, and if you watched the series on paragraphs, you might remember from the episode on conclusion paragraphs that one of the things that you can and perhaps should do in your conclusion is circle back around to the story that you told at the beginning of your text. And Stevenson does that nicely. Let's look at his last paragraph. What threatened to kill me on the streets of Atlanta when I was a young attorney wasn't just a misguided police officer with a gun. It was the force of America's history of racial injustice and the presumption of guilt it caused. Bryan Stevenson wasn't alive to be lynched in the post-Civil War South. Bryan Stevenson has never been tried in a capital punishment case. He's never been executed, but he has had an experience of being literally at the barrel of the gun of a police officer with the weight, the force, he uses the word force, of all of American history pointed in its most deadly form at him. So when he talks about what we should do, because America's criminal justice system is still so distorted and affected by our history of lynchings, he is speaking from personal experience. Now, again, I'm going to reference back to Series 2 about concluding paragraphs. Not only does Stevenson circle back to the story that he opened his text with, he also includes another good closing strategy. And so I'm just going to slip this in here. He has a call to action. Okay, and we can put that up on the screen. This is one of his last paragraphs. It's not his last paragraph, but one of his last paragraphs. It goes like this. Given the racial disparities that still exist in this country, we should eliminate the death penalty and expressly identify our history of lynching as a basis for its abolition. So there, that middle sentence in that paragraph is his call to action, right? He has spent the whole of his essay up to that point establishing that our racist history resonates in our criminal justice system today. And so, because he's established that as true, he says, this is what we've got to do. We have got to get rid of capital punishment. And we have to recognize, he says, we have to honor, we have to say out loud that we are getting rid of capital punishment because it remains a legacy of our racist past. Very strong, very powerful call to action there near the end of his text. I'm sorry, that was a little aside, but I wanted to point out that these strategies that I talk about in these videos, these are the things that real authors do. And Stevenson has taken that call to action and that idea of bringing back his opening story to put there into his conclusion. And one more time, if you have not read the whole thing, you're just staring blankly at me reading the thing to you, stop, pause, hit pause, click on that link down in the description and read the whole thing. One last point, and it's actually 3 points that I'm putting together as 1 point. I feel like I'm going to let you down, America, world maybe, but I've also let myself down, and I acknowledge that, and I'm willing to live with that disappointment because I cannot come up with an acronym for this, even though I love acronyms. But here's the last thing I want to leave you with, and those are the initials Q, P, and S. They stand for quote, paraphrase, and summary, and I've actually got a pyramid. Can we put up the pyramid? There we go. There, so you can see at the top of the pyramid, and the smallest possible area is where the quote is, and then just below that you can see paraphrase. There's a little bit more area there, but still not a lot. And then the giant bulk of the pyramid is summary. And that's the ratio you should be thinking about when you are using outside sources. Now, again, you can make an argument with no outside sources at all. You can rely on personal experience or current events or Beyonce quotes. Okay, that's, I mean, depending on the argument, that's okay. And you can make an argument that is the opposite, that is only outside sources and you don't include your personal experiences and you don't talk about current events or Beyonce. But if you are using outside sources, right, we already talked about quoting the face instead of the beans. So you're giving me or your teacher, you're giving 1 or 2 or 5 words at a time instead of these long stretches where we kind of have to hunt for the relevant part of the quote. But more than that, or equally important to that at least, is that you don't overquote. If your argument so relies on the literal word for wordedness of someone else's text, then is it really your argument anymore? Quote sparingly. And a quote, as I just suggested, there is literally word for word. Every time you use word for word, even if it's 3 words, 4 words, 5 words, you have to put that in quotation marks, and you have to let the teacher know through a reasonable system of citation, whether it's inline in a paragraph or a footnote or whatever. You and your teacher can work out how that should be done. My students talk to me, or, you know, we've already talked about it in class, one of those two. You have to use quotation marks, and you have to acknowledge that they came from a source. When you are paraphrasing, a paraphrase is your words that takes up basically the same length as the quote would have, but it's, you feel like you can phrase it in a better way or a clearer way or a way that more closely connects to your argument. That does not mean that you distort the words of your outside source when you paraphrase them. You do not do that. You must retain the original meaning of the words that you paraphrase. And again, you should indicate that that information came from a source. I get a lot of essays these days where somebody has taken to the Google, they have typed in the question that they're supposed to be answering, and they've copied and pasted into their own document, but then gone through and changed some of the more important nouns or verbs. That's not paraphrasing. That's not quoting. That's cheating. A paraphrase is where you see what the original author has written, you make sure that you understand it, and then you put it back out there in your own words with an acknowledgement to the original source where it came from. Because here's the thing about Google. If you can Google it, I can Google it. And if you just go in and change a few of the important nouns and verbs, you know what? When I type a string of text from your essay into the Google, it's still gonna bring up the result that you copied from. So don't think that that is a way to get around actually learning. It's not, it's cheating. Finally, we have summary. Summary is where you take a large amount of words by another author and you put them into a very few words of your own. Summary compresses. Stevenson does a lot of summary. He talks about whole decades of history in a single paragraph, and he does that effectively. He does not need to document every single lynching. He talks about how he and his organization have documented every single lynching, but he then does not go into a description of every single one. He doesn't need to. He can just summarize that this is the history of America that has led us to this point in time. And summary is what you should be doing the most of with your outside sources. So QPS, again, I'm sorry, not a cute acronym, but it is something that you can remember because it's in order of least to most, QPS, when you are using those outside sources. I know I threw a lot of you today. I talked about faces and beans, I talked about row, I talked about QPS. I understand. If you need to rewatch parts of this, I encourage it. I should probably be saying that at the end of every video, right? Like, oh, just rewind to the part that you need help. That's, I don't know, too late. There's a bunch of them already out there. Here's the deal. We got one more where we're going to be using the Stevenson text as our mentor text, and we're going to be talking about warrants. Warrants are critically important in making good arguments, but they're also the most difficult to explain what they are and how to use them well. So if any of these are going to be useful to you, it's probably going to be the next one, which I will see you for. You believe that there were pesticides or some other chemicals on the strawberries, and you feel very sad now to be reliving that experience of hugging the toilet and the strawberry vomit. I'm sorry that happened to you.